Welcome to a journey through time, where the ancient mysteries of Ohio unfold before you like pages of a forgotten book. Tonight, we explore 2,000 years of hidden history, from mysterious mound builders who shaped the land long before Columbus, to industrial giants who transformed America. Close your eyes and let the gentle rhythm of Ohio's past guide you into peaceful rest. Why watch until the end? Because buried within these stories are secrets that history books overlooked, mysteries that archaeologists are still unraveling, and tales that will transport you to another time. This is part one of our comprehensive journey, covering ancient civilizations through the formation of Ohio's estate. Before we begin, subscribe to join our community of history lovers and drop a comment below what era of Ohio history intrigues you most. Now settle in, relax, and let Ohio's ancient whispers carry you away. Number 1. Ancient mound builders. Long before European explorers set foot on North American soil, long before the first colonial settlements dotted the eastern seaboard, the land we now call Ohio was home to one of the most sophisticated and mysterious civilizations north of Mexico. The story begins nearly 2,000 years ago, when indigenous peoples began constructing massive earthen structures that would puzzle generations of archaeologists and capture the imagination of anyone who gazed upon them. The Adena culture emerged around 1000 BCE, making them among the earliest mound-building societies in the Ohio Valley. These ancient people were not merely primitive hunters and gatherers, as early European settlers mistakenly believed. They were sophisticated engineers, astronomers, artists, and traders who created a complex society that thrived for over 1,000 years. The Adena people built conical burial mounds, some reaching heights of 60 feet or more, constructed with such precision that they have survived millennia of weathering, cultivation, and human interference. Imagine the labor involved in creating these monuments. Without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, the Adena people moved millions of cubic feet of earth, one basket at a time. Each mound was not merely a pile of dirt, but a carefully engineered structure. The builders would first clear and prepare the ground, often burning the vegetation to create a clean surface. Then they would begin the painstaking process of excavation and construction, carrying basket after basket of earth to the designated spot. The soil itself was often chosen deliberately. Different colored clays and soils were layered to create patterns that held ceremonial or symbolic significance. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County stands as perhaps the most enigmatic of all Ohio's ancient earthworks. Stretching nearly a quarter mile in length, this massive effigy mound winds across the landscape in the unmistakable form of a serpent with an egg in its mouth, or perhaps swallowing an egg. The interpretation remains debated. Unlike burial mounds, the serpent mound contains no artifacts, no human remains, nothing to clearly indicate its purpose. Carbon dating has proven frustratingly inconsistent, with some samples suggesting construction around 300 BCE by the Adena, while others point to 1070 CE and the Fort Ancient culture. What makes the Serpent Mound even more remarkable is its astronomical alignment. The head of the serpent aligns with the summer solstice sunset. The coils align with the winter solstice sunrise and the equinox sunrises. This was no accident. The builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and geometry, knowledge that they encoded in earth and stone. They were tracking the heavens, marking the passage of seasons, creating a calendar written in landscape that would endure for centuries. The purpose of such an elaborate construction remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. Was it a ceremonial site, an astronomical observatory, a territorial marker visible from great distances? Perhaps it served all these functions and more. Native American oral traditions speak of the serpent as a powerful spiritual symbol representing renewal, transformation, and the connection between earth and sky. The egg might symbolize creation, the sun, or the moon. Without written records, we can only speculate. But the very existence of such monuments speaks to a people with deep spiritual beliefs, complex social organization, and the leisure time that comes from successful adaptation to their environment. Following the Adena came the Hopewell culture, flourishing from around 100 BCE to 500 CE. The Hopewell people took mound building to unprecedented heights of sophistication. Their earthworks were not merely individual mounds, but vast geometric complexes encompassing dozens of square miles. The Newark earthworks, once covering 4 square miles, represented the largest complex of geometric earthworks in the world. Circles, octagons, squares, and parallel walls stretched across the landscape in precise mathematical relationships. The Hopewell people were master traders, establishing networks that stretch from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Archaeologists excavating Hopewell burial mounds have discovered obsidian from Wyoming, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, and shark teeth from the Atlantic. These weren't merely traded goods passing through. They were carefully crafted into elaborate ceremonial objects that were then buried with the elite dead. The craftsmanship of Hopewell artisans rivals anything produced in the ancient world. They hammered copper into breastplates, headdresses, and ceremonial objects with such skill that modern metallurgists marvel at their techniques. They carved stone to pipes shaped like animals, birds, and humans with stunning realism. They cut sheets of mica into geometric shapes and animal forms, objects that seem to have had ceremonial rather than practical purposes. They worked with materials that required extensive knowledge of their properties, knowledge passed down through generations of craftspeople. The social organization required to create the Hopewell earthworks staggers the imagination. The Newark earthworks alone would have required moving approximately 7 million cubic feet of earth. The Great Circle at Newark measures 1,200 feet in diameter, with walls up to 14 feet high. The Octagon earthworks cover 50 acres with walls 5 to 6 feet high. These structures weren't built in a year or even a generation. They represented the accumulated labor of centuries, the collective effort of a society that could organize, feed, and coordinate hundreds or thousands of workers. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Hopewell earthworks is their precise astronomical alignments. The Newark Octagon aligns with the 18.5-year lunar cycle, tracking the moon's maximum and minimum rising and setting points along the horizon. This cycle, known as the lunar standstill, requires decades of careful observation to document. The Hopewell astronomers were not merely noting where the moon rose tonight. They were tracking subtle changes that occurred over nearly 2 decades, predicting future positions and encoding this knowledge in monuments that would preserve it for future generations. Why did the Hopewell civilization decline? Around 500 CE, the elaborate burial mounds ceased, the long-distance trade networks collapsed, and the great earthwork complexes were abandoned. Climate change may have played a role. Political upheaval could have disrupted society. Disease might have decimated the population. Or perhaps the religious beliefs that motivated the construction of such monuments simply changed, and with them, the entire social structure that supported Hopewell culture. The Fort Ancient culture emerged around 1000 CE, representing a different approach to life in the Ohio Valley. While they built some mounds and earthworks, the Fort Ancient people focused more on fortified hilltop enclosures, suggesting a greater concern with defense. They were accomplished farmers, cultivating corn, beans, and squash in the rich river valleys. They created distinctive pottery, often decorated with intricate designs. They lived in substantial houses, sometimes grouped in villages of considerable size. The Fort Ancient people witnessed the arrival of European diseases before they ever saw a European face. Epidemics spread along trade routes, devastating populations that had no immunity to Old World pathogens. By the time European explorers reached the Ohio Valley in the 17th century, the Fort Ancient culture had already disappeared, their villages abandoned, their people either dead or scattered. When European settlers first encountered the massive earthworks of Ohio, they simply could not believe that the Native Americans they met were capable of such constructions. This racist assumption led to wild theories about lost civilizations. Perhaps the lost tribes of Israel, or refugees from Atlantis, or ancient Vikings had built the mounds. The idea that indigenous Americans could have created sophisticated civilizations was, to many European minds, simply unthinkable. This prejudice had devastating consequences. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers destroyed thousands of mounds. They plowed them under to plant crops. They excavated them carelessly, destroying irreplaceable archaeological evidence in search of treasure. They built roads and buildings directly over them. Of the thousands of mounds that once dotted Ohio, only a fraction survive today, preserved through the efforts of archaeologists and conservationists who recognize their irreplaceable value. Modern archaeology has vindicated the indigenous builders of Ohio's earthworks. Advanced survey techniques, including LIDAR, light detection and ranging, have revealed the true extent and sophistication of these ancient constructions. What earlier archaeologists thought were random mounds are now revealed as parts of vast complexes, aligned with astronomical precision, laid out according to sophisticated geometric principles. The mound builders were not primitive savages, but accomplished engineers, astronomers, and artists who created monuments that rival anything produced in the ancient world. The legacy of the mound builders extends beyond the physical structures they left behind. They demonstrated that complex civilizations could flourish in North America long before European contact. They showed that humans could fundamentally alter landscapes, creating enduring monuments that would outlast their creators by millennia. They proved that astronomical knowledge, geometric precision, and architectural sophistication were not the exclusive domain of Old World civilizations. Today, sites like Serpent Mound, the Newark Earthworks, and Fort Ancient State Park stand as testaments to the ingenuity and vision of Ohio's ancient inhabitants. They remind us that history is deeper and more complex than we often imagine. They challenge us to reconsider our assumptions about the past and to recognize the achievements of peoples whose names we will never know, but whose works continue to inspire wonder and respect. As you drift towards sleep, imagine standing on one of these ancient mounds at dawn. The mist rises from the river valley below. The sun breaks over the eastern horizon, its rays striking the earthwork exactly where ancient astronomers predicted it would 2,000 years ago. You are standing in a place shaped by human hands for purposes we can only partially understand, a monument to ambition, faith, and the enduring human desire to create something that will outlast our brief time on Earth. The mound builders are gone, but their works remain, silent witnesses to civilizations that rose and fell while leaving their mark on the landscape. These earthen monuments speak to us across millennia, whispering secrets about the people who built them, the beliefs that motivated them, and the knowledge they possessed. In their presence, we are humbled by the realization that the human story in North America extends far beyond the few centuries of European occupation, reaching back into the mists of prehistory where mystery and wonder still reside. Number 2. French and British claims the story of European involvement in Ohio begins not with settlers or even explorers, but with rumors, legends, and the insatiable European appetite for new territories and resources. Long before any European set foot in what would become Ohio, the region existed in European imagination as a land of possibility, danger, and potential wealth. The French and British empires, locked in a centuries-long struggle for global dominance, would transform Ohio into a battleground where empires clashed and the future of a continent was decided. The French were the first Europeans to explore the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley. In the 17th century, French explorers, missionaries, and traders pushed westward from their settlements along the St. Lawrence River, venturing into the vast interior of North America. Unlike the British, who established permanent agricultural settlements along the Atlantic coast, the French pursued a different strategy. They sought to control territory through a network of forts, trading posts and alliances with Native American tribes. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, stands as one of the most ambitious French explorers. In 1669 and 1670, La Salle explored the Ohio River, claiming the entire watershed for France. His expedition marked the beginning of French claims to the Ohio Valley, claims that would bring France into direct conflict with British colonial aspirations. La Salle envisioned a vast French empire stretching from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, with the Ohio and Mississippi rivers serving as highways of trade and communication. French traders established relationships with Native American tribes throughout the Ohio Valley, exchanging European manufactured goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth and ornaments for furs, particularly beaver pelts that were in high demand in Europe for making felt hats. These trading relationships were more than mere economic transactions. They involved gift-giving, intermarriage, adoption ceremonies, and complex diplomatic protocols. French traders often lived among Native American communities, learned indigenous languages, and fathered children who bridged two cultures. The French understood that controlling the Ohio Valley required more than claiming it on a map. They needed to establish a physical presence through forts and trading posts, and they needed to maintain alliances with the numerous Native American tribes who actually controlled the territory. The French pursued this strategy with considerable success, building a chain of forts from Canada to Louisiana and cultivating relationships with tribes like the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware. The British, meanwhile, were expanding westward from their Atlantic coastal colonies. Pennsylvania traders began venturing across the Allegheny Mountains into the Ohio Valley in the early 18th century, seeking furs and new trading opportunities. The British offered trade goods that were often cheaper and of better quality than French goods, giving them a competitive advantage. British traders also operated more independently than their French counterparts, without the same level of government regulation and control. The Ohio Company of Virginia, chartered in 1747, represented a new phase of British interest in the Ohio Valley. This land speculation company received a grant of 200,000 acres in the upper Ohio Valley, with the promise of an additional 300,000 acres if they successfully settled 100 families in the region within 7 years. The Ohio Company planned to establish permanent agricultural settlements, a fundamentally different approach than French trading posts and forts. This difference in colonization strategies, French trading networks versus British agricultural settlements, had profound implications for Native Americans. French trade did not require displacing indigenous peoples from their lands. In fact, French success depended on maintaining good relations with Native American trading partners. British settlement, however, required acquiring land, clearing forests, establishing farms, and creating permanent communities. Each new British settlement meant less land available for Native American hunting, farming, and living. Native American tribes found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. The French and British rivalry offered opportunities to play one European power against the other, securing better trade terms, more gifts, and military support against enemies. But this strategy also drew tribes into European conflicts, forcing them to choose sides in wars that were not of their making. Some tribes allied with the French, others with the British, and some tried to remain neutral, an increasingly difficult position as tensions escalated. The competition between French and British interests in the Ohio Valley came to a head in the 1750s. The French decided to strengthen their claim to the region by constructing a line of forts from Lake Erie south to the Ohio River. In 1753, the French began building Fort Presque Isle, present-day Erie, Pennsylvania, Fort Le Boeuf, and Fort Machaut. These forts were designed to block British expansion westward and secure French control of the strategically vital Ohio Valley. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie viewed French fort building as a direct challenge to British claims and British colonial interests. In late 1753, Dinwiddie dispatched a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington to deliver a message to the French commander demanding that French forces withdraw from the Ohio Valley. Washington was only 21 years old, but he possessed ambition, courage, and a willingness to venture into dangerous territory. Washington's journey to the French forts in the winter of 1753 to 1754 was arduous and dangerous. He traveled hundreds of miles through wilderness, facing harsh weather, difficult terrain, and potential hostility from both French forces and Native Americans. When Washington finally met with the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, he delivered Dinwiddie's message demanding French withdrawal. The French commander was polite but firm. France claimed the Ohio Valley, and France would not withdraw. Washington returned to Virginia with the French refusal, confirming what Dinwiddie already suspected: the French would not yield without a fight. In 1754, Dinwiddie sent Washington back to the Ohio Valley, this time with a military force, to construct a fort at the strategically important junction where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River, present-day Pittsburgh. Washington arrived to discover that the French had beaten him to the location and were already constructing Fort Duquesne. What happened next would help spark a global war. In May 1754, Washington's force encountered a small French scouting party. In the brief skirmish that followed, the French commander, Joseph Coulon de Villiers, Sieur de Jumonville, was killed. The French claimed Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission and had been assassinated. Washington maintained that the French were spies and he had acted appropriately. Regardless of the truth, the incident escalated tensions dramatically. Washington hastily constructed Fort Necessity, a crude fortification in a meadow, knowing that French retaliation was inevitable. On July 3, 1754, a much larger French and Native American force attacked Fort Necessity. After a day-long battle fought in heavy rain, with his force suffering significant casualties and running low on ammunition and supplies, Washington was forced to surrender. The French allowed Washington and his surviving men to return to Virginia, but the message was clear: France would defend its claims to the Ohio Valley with military force. The skirmishes in the Ohio Valley in 1754 were the opening shots of what would become the French and Indian War in North America, a conflict that would merge with the 7 Years' War in Europe, drawing in European powers across multiple continents. The Ohio Valley, a region most Europeans had never seen and could barely locate on a map, had become the spark that ignited a global conflagration. The French and Indian War transformed the Ohio Valley into a battleground. British forces, colonial militias, and their Native American allies fought against French troops, Canadian militia, and France's Native American allies in a bitter struggle for control of the region. Forts were besieged, villages burned, prisoners taken, and atrocities committed by all sides. The conflict was particularly brutal because it combined European-style warfare with Native American raiding tactics, creating a hybrid form of combat that was devastating to military forces and civilian populations alike. The British struggled in the early years of the war. General Edward Braddock's disastrous 1755 expedition to capture Fort Duquesne ended in catastrophic defeat when his force was ambushed by French and Native American forces. Braddock was mortally wounded and his army was routed, fleeing in panic back to Virginia. The defeat sent shockwaves through the British colonies and demonstrated that European military tactics, formations of soldiers firing in volleys, were poorly suited to wilderness warfare. Gradually, the tide turned in Britain's favor. The British committed more resources to the North American theater, recognizing that control of the continent was worth the investment. British and colonial forces captured French forts one by one, squeezing the French presence in the Ohio Valley. In 1758, British forces under General John Forbes finally captured Fort Duquesne, which the French had abandoned and burned rather than let it fall into British hands. Forbes rebuilt the fort and renamed it Fort Pitt in honor of British Prime Minister William Pitt. The fall of Fort Duquesne marked the effective end of French power in the Ohio Valley, though the war would continue until 1763. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the French and Indian War, resulted in France ceding all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The French Empire in North America, which had once stretched from Canada to Louisiana, was no more. Britain emerged as the dominant European power in North America, controlling a vast territory stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. But British victory did not mean peace in the Ohio Valley. Native American tribes had allied with France, not out of love for French culture, but because French trading posts and military alliances served their interests. The defeat of France left Native Americans facing British power without their French allies to provide a counterbalance. Many tribes realized too late that they had chosen the losing side in a conflict between European empires, and now they would face the consequences. The British assumed that their victory over France meant they now controlled the Ohio Valley. Native Americans disagreed. From their perspective, the land belonged to them, not to whichever European power claimed it on a map. The French had been trading partners and military allies, not rulers. Native Americans expected the British to behave similarly, maintaining trading relationships without demanding territorial concessions or imposing British authority. British officials, however, had different ideas. They saw the Ohio Valley as territory that Britain had won through military conquest, territory that could be surveyed, divided, granted to land companies, and open to settlement. This fundamental disagreement about who owned the Ohio Valley and what rights came with that ownership would lead to further conflict. Even as the guns of the French and Indian War fell silent, the French and British struggle for the Ohio Valley had profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military outcomes. The massive debt Britain incurred fighting the French and Indian War would lead to new taxes on the American colonies, taxes that would generate resentment and ultimately contribute to the American Revolution. The military experience gained by colonial officers like George Washington during the French and Indian War would prove invaluable when those same officers found themselves fighting against Britain rather than for it. For Native Americans, the French defeat meant the loss of the ability to play European powers against each other, a diplomatic strategy that had provided at least some leverage in dealing with European expansion. The British victory meant that the flood of settlers into the Ohio Valley, held back partially by French resistance and French alliances with Native American tribes, would now accelerate, bringing new pressures and new conflicts. The land itself bore the scars of the conflict. Forts dotted the landscape, many abandoned or garrisoned by small British detachments. Trading posts stood empty or under new management. Villages that had thrived on the fur trade now faced an uncertain future. The forests and rivers remained, but the human geography of the Ohio Valley had been fundamentally transformed by the clash of empires. As you settle into sleep, imagine the Ohio Valley in those turbulent decades of the mid-18th century. French traders paddling canoes laden with trade goods up the rivers. British surveyors marking trees to establish land claims. Native American warriors gathered in council, debating which European power to ally with or whether to resist both. The sound of axes felling trees to build forts, the crack of musket fire echoing through the forest, the smoke of burning villages drifting on the wind. This was a time when the future was uncertain, when maps showed boundaries that no one on the ground recognized, when loyalty and alliance shifted like the currents of the Ohio River. It was a time of transformation, when one era ended and another began, when the contest between European empires would give way to new conflicts and new nations. The French and British may have fought over Ohio, but they were only temporary players in a much longer story. A story that was old when they arrived and would continue long after their empires crumbled into history. Number 3. Northwest Territory Formation. The American Revolution's conclusion in 1783 created a new and unprecedented situation in North America. For the first time, a Republican government controlled a vast western territory stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The question of what to do with this territory, how to govern it, how to divide it, how to prevent it from becoming a source of conflict and instability, would shape the future of the United States in profound ways. Ohio would become the testing ground for American expansion, the place where the new nation would determine how to transform wilderness into states, how to balance competing interests, and how to create order from potential chaos. The Western lands posed both enormous opportunities and serious challenges for the young United States. The opportunity was obvious: vast territories of fertile land that could be surveyed, divided, and sold to generate desperately needed revenue for a government burdened with massive war debts. The land could also provide farms for a growing population, rewarding Revolutionary War veterans with land grants and offering opportunities for citizens to improve their circumstances through westward migration. The challenges were equally significant. The original 13 states had overlapping and often contradictory claims to Western lands based on colonial charters that frequently granted territory from sea to sea. Virginia claimed a huge swath of the Northwest based on its colonial charter. Connecticut claimed a strip of land along the southern shore of Lake Erie called the Western Reserve. Massachusetts, New York, and other states also pressed claims. These competing claims threatened to tear apart the fragile confederation of states before it had even solidified. Native Americans presented another challenge. Tribes, including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, and others, had lived in the Ohio Valley for generations. They had fought alongside the British during the Revolution, hoping that a British victory would slow or stop American expansion westward. The American victory meant they now faced a government that viewed them as defeated enemies occupying land that, by right of conquest, belonged to the United States. Native Americans, understandably, saw things differently. The Confederation Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, took on the task of resolving these challenges. In a series of remarkable decisions between 1784 and 1787, Congress created a system for organizing and governing Western territories that would become one of the young nation's most important achievements. These decisions demonstrated that the United States could expand in an orderly fashion, incorporating new territories and eventually new states on an equal footing with the original 13. The first step was persuading states to cede their Western land claims to the federal government. Virginia took the lead in 1784, ceding its claims to the territory northwest of the Ohio River. Other states followed, some more reluctantly than others. Connecticut retained the Western Reserve for several more years before finally ceding it to federal control. By the mid-1780s, the United States government controlled the Northwest Territory, a vast region encompassing present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Thomas Jefferson drafted an initial ordinance for governing Western territories in 1784. Jefferson's plan proposed dividing the Northwest Territory into districts, each of which would eventually become a state. His proposal included provisions prohibiting slavery in the new territories after 1800, an idea ahead of its time that met resistance and was ultimately not included in the final legislation. Jefferson envisioned a systematic approach to westward expansion, with clearly defined stages of government and specific requirements for statehood. The Land Ordinance of 1785 addressed the practical question of how to survey and divide the western lands. Rather than the chaotic system used in the original 13 states, where land boundaries were often described by reference to trees, streams, and rocks, creating endless boundary disputes, the 1785 ordinance established a rectangular survey system. Surveyors would divide the land into townships 6 miles square, with each township subdivided into 36 sections of 1 square mile, 640 acres, This grid system would be extended across most of the western United States, creating the characteristic checkerboard pattern visible from the air across much of the American Midwest. The rectangular survey system was a triumph of rational planning over geography. Rivers, hills, and natural features were largely ignored in favor of straight lines running north-south and east-west. The system made land easy to describe, buy, and sell. A farmer could purchase the southeast quarter of Section 16, Township 3 North, Range 2 West, and know exactly what he was buying without ever seeing the land. The system also reserved specific sections in each township for supporting public schools, an early commitment to public education that would shape Ohio's development. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established the governmental framework for the Northwest Territory. This remarkable document, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history, created a three-stage process for territories to progress towards statehood. In the first stage, Congress would appoint a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to govern the territory. In the second stage, when the territory had 5,000 free adult males, it could elect the legislature and send a non-voting delegate to Congress. In the third stage, when the territory's population reached 60,000, it could draft a constitution and apply for statehood on equal terms with existing states. The Northwest Ordinance also included a Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of religion, the right to trial by jury, and other fundamental liberties. It encouraged education, stating that religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Most significantly, it prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, declaring that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. This prohibition of slavery would have enormous consequences for Ohio and the entire region. The Northwest Territory would develop as free territory, while lands south of the Ohio River, Kentucky and Tennessee, developed with slavery. The Ohio River became a border between freedom and bondage, a boundary that would shape migration patterns, economic development, and eventually contribute to the sectional tensions that led to the Civil War. The Northwest Ordinance created a blueprint for American expansion that solved one of history's most difficult problems. How can an empire expand without creating colonies? Previous empires, British, French, Spanish, Roman, had ruled distant territories as inferior provinces, governed by officials appointed from the imperial center, with local populations having little or no voice in their own governance. The Northwest Ordinance promised something different. Territories would be temporary conditions, not permanent states of colonial subordination. Territories would progress towards statehood, joining the Union as equal partners with the original states. This promise of equality transformed American expansion from a potentially empire-building enterprise into a genuinely nation-building project. New states would not be colonies subordinate to the original 13. They would be full partners in the American experiment. This promise helped legitimize westward expansion in the eyes of many Americans and provided a powerful incentive for migration. Settlers moving west weren't creating new colonies, they were extending the republic. But the ideals expressed in the Northwest Ordinance existed in tension with the reality on the ground. The ordinance spoke of orderly development, Republican government, and individual rights. It made no mention of the Native Americans who actually lived in the territory, except by implication. The ordinance assumed that the land was available for American settlement, that Native American claims could be extinguished through treaties or conquest, and that the indigenous peoples would either assimilate, move west, or be removed by force. General Arthur St. Clair became the first governor of the Northwest Territory in 1788. St. Clair faced the unenviable task of imposing American authority on a territory that was nominally American, but practically still controlled by Native American tribes and British trading interests. The British, despite having ceded the territory to the United States in the Treaty of Paris, maintained forts and trading posts in the Northwest, encouraged Native American resistance to American expansion, and showed no inclination to actually withdraw their presence. The first American settlements in Ohio were established by two land companies. The Ohio Company of Associates, led by Revolutionary War veterans, founded Marietta in April 1788 at the confluence of the Muskingum and Ohio rivers. The settlement was named for Marie Antoinette, in gratitude for French support during the Revolution, an ironic choice given that Marie Antoinette would lose her head to the guillotine just 5 years later. The settlers constructed fortifications, laid out orderly streets, and began clearing land for farming. John Cleves Sims purchased land between the Great Miami and Little Miami rivers and founded several settlements, including what would become Cincinnati. These early settlements were precarious ventures. Settlers lived behind fortifications, fearful of Native American attacks. They struggled with disease, crop failures, and the harsh realities of frontier life. Many of the initial settlers gave up and returned east, defeated by the challenges of establishing civilization in wilderness. The Native American tribes of Ohio viewed these settlements with alarm and anger. American settlers were not traders who could be accommodated. They were farmers who cleared forests, plowed fields, and claimed ownership of land that Native Americans considered their own. Treaties signed between the United States and various tribes meant little. Settlers often moved onto land before it had been legally ceded. And even when treaties existed, they were frequently negotiated under duress or signed by chiefs who did not represent all tribal members. The conflict between American expansion and Native American resistance would dominate Ohio's early territorial period. Governor St. Clair attempted to impose American authority through military expeditions that proved disastrous. The Northwest Territory was supposed to be a model of orderly development, Republican government, and peaceful settlement. Instead, it became a violent frontier where two incompatible visions of the future clashed in forests and fields, fought out in raids, sieges, and battles that would determine who would control the land and what kind of society would take root in Ohio. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the Northwest Territory in those formative years of the late 1780s. Survey crews marking lines through endless forests, creating a geometric order that ignored the natural landscape. Settlers arriving by flatboat on the Ohio River, their possessions piled around them, wondering what awaited them in this new land. Native American warriors gathering in council, debating how to respond to the newcomers who kept coming, no matter how many were driven away. Soldiers drilling in crude forts, preparing for campaigns that would test whether the United States could enforce its claim to territory it legally owned, but did not actually control. The Northwest Territory represented an idea, the idea that expansion could be orderly, that new territories could become equal states, that a republic could grow without becoming an empire. But ideas, however noble, must contend with reality. And the reality of the Northwest Territory was far more complicated, violent, and uncertain than the elegant language of the Northwest Ordinance suggested. The formation of the territory was not an end, but a beginning, the first chapter in a longer story of conflict, growth, and transformation. Number 4. Native American resistance wars. The establishment of the Northwest Territory and the arrival of American settlers triggered a desperate and violent struggle for control of Ohio. For Native Americans, this was an existential fight, a battle to preserve their homelands, their way of life, and their very existence as independent peoples. For the United States, it was a test of whether the new nation could extend its authority beyond the Appalachians and make good on its claims to Western territories. The conflict would drag on for more than 2 decades, involving devastating defeats, hard-won victories, and ultimately the displacement of the Native American peoples who had called Ohio home for generations. The Native American tribes of Ohio were not a unified force, but the shared threat of American expansion drove them to unprecedented cooperation. The Miami, Shawnee Delaware, Wyandot, and other tribes formed a loose confederacy, united by the common goal of stopping American settlement north of the Ohio River. They received support and encouragement from the British, who maintained posts and trading interests in the region and saw Native American resistance as a useful check on American expansion. The Native American strategy was to make American settlement so costly and dangerous that the United States would give up its efforts to colonize the Ohio country. Warriors raided isolated settlements, ambushed survey parties, and attacked supply convoys. The goal was not to win a decisive military victory. The Native Americans understood they could not defeat the United States in conventional warfare, but to make the price of expansion too high to pay. If settlers lived in constant fear, if every farm was vulnerable to attack, if every journey through the wilderness risked ambush, then perhaps the Americans would conclude that Ohio was not worth the cost. This strategy initially proved effective. Settlers huddled in fortified stations, afraid to venture far from protection. Agriculture was difficult when farmers had to work their fields with weapons close at hand, alert for any sign of danger. The territorial government struggled to establish authority beyond the immediate vicinity of its few settlements. Marietta, Cincinnati, and a handful of other settlements clung to existence, but the grand vision of orderly townships spreading across Ohio remained just that, a vision, not a reality. Governor Arthur St. Clair decided that military force was necessary to break Native American resistance. In 1790, he authorized General Josiah Harmar to lead an expedition against Native American villages along the Maumee River in northwestern Ohio. Harmar commanded a force of about 1,400 men, mostly poorly trained militia with a core of regular army troops. The expedition set out in September 1790, marching north from Fort Washington, present-day Cincinnati, through the wilderness. Harmar's expedition was a disaster. His force burned several abandoned villages but failed to engage the main Native American forces. When Harmar finally encountered warriors led by Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, his militia broke and ran. In two separate engagements, Harmar's force suffered heavy casualties, losing nearly 200 men killed. The survivors retreated in disarray back to Fort Washington, having accomplished nothing except to demonstrate American military weakness. The defeat humiliated St. Clair and the United States government. It emboldened Native American resistance and convinced many tribes that they could successfully defend their lands against American expansion. St. Clair decided to personally lead a larger and better equipped expedition to crush Native American resistance once and for all. In the fall of 1791, St. Clair assembled an army of about 2,000 men and marched north from Fort Washington, building a series of forts as he advanced. St. Clair's expedition was plagued with problems from the start. His troops were poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and suffering from disease. Desertions depleted his force daily. His supply line stretched thin as he advanced deeper into Native American territory. On the night of November 3, 1791, St. Clair's army camped along the Wabash River in present-day western Ohio, exhausted and careless about security. Before dawn on November 4, a large Native American force led by Little Turtle attacked St. Clair's camp. The attack was devastating. Half-asleep soldiers stumbled from their tents into a nightmare of musket fire, war cries and hand-to-hand combat. Officers trying to organize a defense were cut down. Militia units broke and fled. Artillery crews were killed at their guns. For 3 hours, the battle raged in chaos and terror. When survivors finally managed to fight their way out of the encirclement and retreat south, they left behind a scene of carnage. Of the approximately 1,000 men who had been in camp that morning, 632 were killed, and 264 wounded, a casualty rate exceeding 90%. It was the worst defeat American forces would ever suffer fighting Native Americans, worse than the Little Bighorn, worse than any other engagement in the long and bloody history of American Indian warfare. News of St. Clair's defeat shocked the nation. President George Washington reportedly flew into a rage when he learned of the disaster. Congress investigated, eventually censuring St. Clair for his conduct of the campaign. The defeat raised serious questions about whether the United States could control the Northwest Territory and whether American expansion would be stopped at the Ohio River. For Native Americans, the victory confirmed that they could defend their lands against American armies. Washington and Congress recognized that a different approach was needed. They turned to General Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War veteran known for his aggressive tactics and his nickname, Mad Anthony. Wayne was given command of a new army, the Legion of the United States, and extensive resources to train and equip it properly. Wayne would not repeat the mistakes of Hamar and St. Clair. Wayne spent 2 years training his legion, drilling his troops relentlessly in tactics and discipline. He built a series of forts extending north from Fort Washington, each serving as a supply base and a position from which to launch further advances. Wayne understood that defeating Native American warriors required more than numbers. It required discipline, proper training, and careful logistics. He would not march north until his army was ready. In the summer of 1794, Wayne's legion advanced into northwestern Ohio, the heart of Native American resistance. The Native Americans, supported by British encouragement and supplied from Fort Miami, a British fort near present-day Toledo, prepared to defend their homeland. Warriors gathered under the leadership of Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, and other chiefs, confident that they could repeat their earlier victories. Little Turtle, however, recognized that Wayne was a different caliber of opponent than Hamar or St. Clair. He advocated for caution, perhaps even negotiation, but the younger warriors, flushed with earlier victories and convinced of their invincibility, pushed for battle. The Confederacy would stand and fight. On August 20th, 1794, Wayne's legion encountered the Native American force near a place where a tornado had felled hundreds of trees, creating a natural barrier of fallen timber. The Battle of Fallen Timbers began with Native American warriors using the fallen logs as cover, firing on Wayne's advancing troops. But Wayne had trained his legion well. His soldiers advanced in good order, absorbed the initial fire, and launched a bayonet charge that broke through the Native American position. The Native Americans retreated toward Fort Miami, expecting the British to provide refuge and support, but the British commander, unwilling to risk war with the United States, kept the fort gates closed. The Native Americans found themselves abandoned by their British allies, driven from the field by Wayne's disciplined troops and facing the collapse of their resistance. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was not particularly large, perhaps 1,000 Native American warriors against 3,000 American troops, and the actual combat lasted less than an hour. But its consequences were enormous. Wayne's victory broke the back of Native American resistance in Ohio. In the months following the battle, Wayne's army systematically destroyed Native American villages throughout northwestern Ohio, burning crops and homes, leaving the tribes facing starvation and homelessness as winter approached. Defeated, starving, and abandoned by the British, Native American leaders had no choice but to negotiate. In the summer of 1795, representatives of 12 tribes gathered with Wayne at Fort Greenville. The resulting Treaty of Greenville ceded most of present-day Ohio to the United States, opening the territory to American settlement. In exchange, the Native Americans received trade goods, annuities, and the promise that they could remain in peace on the lands reserved to them, lands that would prove to be only a temporary refuge. The Treaty of Greenville did not end conflict between Native Americans and American settlers, but it marked a turning point. Native American power in Ohio was broken. The tribes that had fought so desperately to defend their homelands were forced to accept a reality they had tried to resist. Ohio would be American, not Native American. Many families and warriors relocated west of the Mississippi, seeking lands not yet claimed by American settlers. Others remained, accepting reservation lands and attempting to adapt to life in a world increasingly dominated by American authority. The Native American resistance wars in Ohio were tragic on multiple levels. They represented the collision of two incompatible systems, one based on communal land use and tribal autonomy, the other on private property and territorial sovereignty. The conflict was perhaps inevitable given these incompatibilities, but inevitability does not reduce tragedy. For Native Americans, the wars meant the loss of homelands, the destruction of villages and crops, the death of warriors and leaders, and the forced acceptance of drastically reduced circumstances. For American soldiers, many of them barely trained militia, the wars meant terror, suffering, and death in a wilderness far from home. For settlers, it meant years of fear, the constant threat of attack, and the knowledge that their desire for land was purchased with Native American dispossession and suffering. The wars left scars on the landscape, burnt villages, abandoned forts, burial grounds, and deeper scars in the collective memory of peoples who had fought a desperate struggle for incompatible futures. The Native American resistance wars also revealed the determination of the United States to make good on its territorial claims. Despite devastating defeats, despite the enormous costs in money and lives, despite the difficulty of projecting military power across hundreds of miles of wilderness, the United States persisted. The Northwest Ordinance had promised orderly expansion and Republican government, but achieving that promise required conquering the people who already lived on the land. The territory had to be pacified before it could be surveyed, settled, and organized into states. As you settle into sleep, imagine the forests of Ohio in those years of conflict, the sound of drums echoing through the trees as warriors prepared for battle, the crack of musket fire at fallen timbers, the cries of wounded soldiers and warriors, the smoke of burning villages rising into the sky, the silence that followed battle, broken only by the wind through the trees and the cries of carrion birds. Imagine, too, the councils where Native American leaders debated their responses to American expansion. Should they fight or negotiate? Should they accept the Americans' terms or resist to the last? Should they trust the promises of peace or prepare for further conflict? These were impossible choices, decisions made in desperate circumstances with no good options available. And imagine the American soldiers, many of them young men far from home, marching through wilderness toward an uncertain encounter with an enemy who knew the terrain, who could appear and disappear like ghosts, who fought with a desperation born of defending their homes and families. These soldiers were instruments of a policy of expansion and conquest, but they were also human beings, afraid and uncertain, wondering if they would survive to return to their own homes and families. The Native American resistance wars were a foundational chapter in Ohio's history, a violent struggle that determined who would control the land and what kind of society would develop there. The outcome was never really in doubt. The United States had too many people, too many resources, and too much determination to be stopped. But the Native Americans fought anyway, with courage and skill, defending their homelands against overwhelming odds. Their resistance, though ultimately unsuccessful, was a testament to the human spirit and to the depth of their connection to the land they called home. Number 5. Early settlement and statehood. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 opened Ohio to a flood of American settlement that transformed the territory from a dangerous frontier into a rapidly developing region poised to become a state. The years between 1795 and Ohio's admission to the Union in 1803 witnessed extraordinary growth, social experimentation, political conflict, and the emergence of a distinctly American frontier society. This was Ohio's formative period, when the patterns and institutions that would shape its future were established, tested, and refined. The population of Ohio in 1790 was estimated at around 3,000 settlers, most huddled in a few fortified settlements along the Ohio River. By 1800, the population had grown to more than 45,000. By 1803, when Ohio achieved statehood, the population exceeded 60,000, the threshold established by the Northwest Ordinance for admission to the Union. This explosive growth reflected the pent-up demand for Western lands, the relative peace following the Treaty of Greenville, and the extraordinary fertility of Ohio's soil. Settlers came from various sources and for various reasons. Revolutionary War veterans claimed land grants given in lieu of payment for their military service. Families from New England seeking better farmland and new opportunities migrated west through New York and Pennsylvania, crossing into the Western Reserve in northeastern Ohio. Southerners from Virginia, Kentucky, and the Carolinas crossed the Ohio River, bringing with them Southern cultural traditions and, in some cases, ambiguous attitudes about slavery despite the Northwest Ordinance's prohibition. The journey to Ohio was arduous and dangerous. Families traveled by wagon over mountain roads that were little more than rough tracks through wilderness. They forded rivers, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and covered perhaps 10 to 15 miles on a good day. Many families sold everything they could not carry, investing their life savings in the gamble that they could build better lives in Ohio. Some traveled by flatboat down the Ohio River, families and possessions piled on crude wooden platforms that drifted with the current, vulnerable to snags, storms, and the occasional attack by river pirates. When settlers arrived at their destination, a section of land purchased from a land company or the government, or perhaps a land grant earned through military service, they faced the backbreaking labor of transforming wilderness into farms. First came the construction of a shelter, often a crude log cabin erected in a matter of days. Then came the work of clearing land, felling trees, removing stumps, burning brush, and preparing the soil for crops. A family might clear only a few acres in the first year, planting corn among the stumps, living on a diet of corn mush, wild game, and whatever they had brought with them. Life on the Ohio frontier was hard, isolated, and uncertain. Medical care was primitive or non-existent. Common ailments could prove fatal. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child. Accidents, a felling tree, a kick from a horse, a badly set broken bone, could result in permanent disability or death. Crop failures meant hunger or even starvation. Neighbors might be miles away, separated by a roadless forest. Community and social life revolved around rare gatherings, house raisings, where neighbors helped build a cabin, corn huskings, religious meetings, and militia musters. Yet despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, frontier communities developed strong bonds of mutual assistance. Settlers helped each other with tasks too large for one family to accomplish alone. They shared tools, skills, and whatever surplus they had in times of shortage. This culture of mutual aid was born of necessity. On the frontier, your neighbor's success or failure directly affected your own welfare. A neighbor's barn raising meant one more farm producing crops. A neighbor's crop failure meant one less family to trade with and one more mouth seeking help. Religious life on the frontier took forms quite different from established churches in the eastern states. Circuit-riding preachers traveled from settlement to settlement, holding services wherever people could gather, in cabins, barns, or outdoor clearings. Camp meetings, where families would gather for days of preaching, singing, and religious fervor, became important social events as well as spiritual occasions. The isolation and hardship of frontier life seemed to intensify religious feeling for some, while others drifted away from organized religion altogether. Education posed particular challenges. Scattered settlement made schools difficult to establish and maintain. Many children grew up with little or no formal education, learning to read, if at all, from family Bibles and whatever books their families owned. Some communities pooled resources to hire teachers. Often educated young men or women working for a few months before moving on. The quality of education varied enormously, and many Ohio children grew to adulthood functionally illiterate despite the Northwest Ordinance's commitment to education. The territorial government struggled to impose order on this rapidly growing and dispersed population. Governor Arthur St. Clair, appointed by President Washington, governed the territory with aristocratic assumptions that conflicted with the democratic spirit of frontier settlers. St. Clair believed in government by educated elites and was suspicious of frontier democracy. He clashed repeatedly with the territorial legislature, which represented the more democratic views of ordinary settlers. Political conflict in territorial Ohio reflected larger debates about democracy, representation, and the proper role of government. St. Clair and his supporters favored property qualifications for voting and office holding, appointed rather than elected officials, and a strong executive. Their opponents, led by men like Thomas Worthington and Edward Tiffin, advocated for broader suffrage, elected officials, and limited government power. These debates would shape Ohio's state constitution when the territory moved towards statehood. The question of slavery simmered beneath the surface of territorial politics. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some settlers from southern states brought enslaved people with them, claiming various legal fictions to circumvent the prohibition. French settlers in the old settlements along the Mississippi River kept enslaved people, claiming that their ownership predated the Northwest Ordinance. Some masters brought enslaved people to Ohio and then freed them, but required them to sign indenture contracts that amounted to temporary slavery. Ohio's free status attracted formerly enslaved people escaping from slavery in Kentucky and Virginia. The Ohio River became a border between bondage and freedom, though freedom in Ohio was precarious. Slave catchers crossed the river in pursuit of escapees, and Ohio's government often cooperated in returning fugitives. Nevertheless, free black communities began to develop in Ohio, and these communities would play important roles in the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement in decades to come. Economic development in early Ohio centered on agriculture, but commerce and small-scale manufacturing also emerged. Farmers needed tools, cloth, shoes, and other manufactured goods. Small mills processed grain, sawmills cut lumber, and blacksmiths, carpenters, and other craftspeople established workshops in growing towns. Cincinnati, positioned at the junction of the Ohio River and the routes north into the interior, emerged as the territory's largest town and commercial center. By 1800, Cincinnati had about 750 residents. By 1810, it would have more than 2,500. Transportation remained a critical challenge. Roads were poor or non-existent. Moving goods overland was slow and expensive. The rivers, the Ohio, Muskingum, Scioto, Miami, and others, served as highways, but they were navigable only by small boats and rafts, and only when water levels permitted. Farmers more than a day's wagon journey from navigable water struggled to get their crops to market. They might grow abundant corn, but if they couldn't transport it to buyers, its value was minimal. This transportation challenge would shape Ohio's economic and political development for decades. The state would invest heavily in internal improvements, roads, canals, and eventually railroads, in efforts to connect its productive interior with markets. The success of these efforts would determine which regions thrived and which stagnated. Towns located on navigable rivers or, later, canals and railroads prospered. Towns bypassed by transportation networks withered or never developed beyond small villages. By 1802, Ohio's population exceeded the 60,000 threshold for statehood established by the Northwest Ordinance. Territorial residents, tired of being governed by federally appointed officials, pressed for statehood. Governor St. Clair opposed immediate statehood, preferring to divide the Northwest Territory into smaller territories that would remain under federal control longer. His opposition alienated settlers and cost him political support. In 1802, Congress authorized Ohio to hold a constitutional convention and prepare for statehood. Delegates gathered in Chillicothe, then the territorial capital, to draft a state constitution. The resulting document reflected frontier democratic ideals. It provided for universal white male suffrage without property qualifications. It created a strong legislature and a weak executive. The governor had minimal powers and could not even veto legislation. Judges were appointed by the legislature rather than elected, reflecting a mixture of democratic and elite Republican principles. The Constitution's treatment of race and slavery revealed the complicated attitudes of early Ohioans. Slavery was prohibited, fulfilling the Northwest Ordinance's requirement. But free black residents were denied the right to vote, serve in the militia, or testify in court cases involving white people. These restrictions reflected the racism of the era and the determination of many white Ohioans to prevent free black people from achieving equal status, even as they opposed slavery. On February 19, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson signed the act admitting Ohio to the Union as the 17th state. Statehood marked the first successful application of the Northwest Ordinance's system for transforming territories into states. Ohio's admission proved that the system worked, that territories could progress from federal control to statehood, joining the Union on equal terms with the original states. This success validated American expansion and provided a model that would be repeated dozens of times as the nation grew westward. Early statehood brought new challenges and opportunities. Ohio's government had to establish institutions, collect taxes, maintain roads, support education, and perform the countless functions of state governance. The state had to negotiate relationships with the federal government, with neighboring states, and with the Native American tribes still living within or near its borders. Ohio had to develop an economy, build infrastructure, and attract new settlers to continue its rapid growth. The state also had to define its identity. Was Ohio a western extension of New England, carrying forward the values and institutions of the Puritan tradition? Was it a northern extension of Southern society, with Virginia influences shaping its culture and politics? Was it something new, a distinctly Western society forged from the mixture of different regional traditions in the crucible of frontier experience? These questions would be debated and answered not through pronouncements but through the lived experience of thousands of Ohioans building communities, raising families, and shaping the state's future. As you drift toward sleep, imagine Ohio in those early years of statehood. Imagine a farm family's cabin on a winter evening, the fire crackling, children sleeping in the loft, parents planning next year's planting. Imagine a flatboat drifting down the Ohio River, a family's possessions lashed to the deck, eyes scanning the shoreline for the landing where their new life will begin. Imagine a town square on market day, farmers trading crops, craftspeople displaying their wares, news and gossip being exchanged. Imagine the sound of axes in the forest as land is cleared for farms. Imagine the songs at a corn husking when neighbors gather to work and socialize. Imagine the silence of a cemetery where settlers who did not survive the hardships of frontier life are buried far from their original homes. Imagine the pride of citizens voting in the first state elections, participating in democratic government, shaping their own future rather than being governed by distant authorities. This was Ohio, finding itself, defining itself, building itself from wilderness into a state. It was hard work, uncertain work, sometimes tragic work, but it was also hopeful work, carried out by people who believed they could build better lives, stronger communities, and a more democratic society. Their success in building Ohio would shape the future not just of one state, but of a nation expanding across a continent, carrying with it the promise and problems of the American experiment in self-government. Number 6, Ohio, the spark of a global war. The forests of Ohio were once so quiet that the sound of a snapping twig could travel for miles. Tall trees formed a living cathedral, their canopies filtering sunlight into soft, shifting patterns on the forest floor. Rivers moved slowly through the land, carrying canoes, fish, and stories from one village to another. For centuries, this region existed beyond the awareness of Europe's great empires. untouched by royal decrees, untouched by maps drawn in distant capitals. But silence does not last forever. By the early 18th century, Ohio had become something far more dangerous than wilderness. It had become an idea, and ideas once born are impossible to contain. To the French, Ohio was the connective tissue of a continental empire, a corridor linking Canada to Louisiana, a network of rivers that promised wealth through trade rather than settlement. To the British, Ohio represented opportunity, fertile land, permanent farms, expanding colonies, and the promise of prosperity for generations yet unborn. To Native American nations, Ohio was not an idea at all. It was home, sacred ground, the inheritance of ancestors and the responsibility of descendants. 3 worlds, 3 visions, 1 land. Conflict was inevitable. The French arrived quietly. They did not bring plows or fences. They brought canoes, trade goods, missionaries, and diplomacy. French traders learned native languages, married into native communities, and adapted themselves to the rhythms of indigenous life. Their forts, small, strategic, lightly garrisoned, were meant to control movement, not dominate land. To the French, power flowed along rivers, not across fields. The British approach could not have been more different. British colonists believed land existed to be owned, cleared, fenced, and farmed. A forest was not a sacred space or a trading route. It was an obstacle. Every acre of Ohio represented potential wealth, and every delay in settlement felt like a loss. British land companies drew lines on maps and sold property they had never seen, promising settlers a future carved from wilderness. As British traders crossed the Appalachian Mountains, friction began to grow. French officials watched with alarm as British influence crept westward, threatening to sever the fragile chain that connected New France. Native American leaders watched with deeper concern. Trade they could manage, forts they could negotiate with. Farms, roads, and families arriving by the thousands were something else entirely. By the 1740s, Ohio was no longer merely contested, it was tense. The Ohio Company of Virginia symbolized the British intention to transform the region forever. Chartered with the blessing of the Crown, it promised settlement, agriculture, and expansion. To the French, this was not commerce, it was invasion. France responded decisively. In the early 1750s, French forces moved south from the Great Lakes, constructing a chain of forts designed to lock Ohio into the French sphere of influence. These forts were not massive stone castles. They were wooden structures, practical and efficient, placed precisely where rivers converged and travel routes intersected. Control the rivers, control Ohio. The British could not ignore this challenge. Virginia's governor sent a message, a demand really, telling the French to withdraw from territory the British claimed as their own. The messenger chosen for this dangerous task was a young, largely untested militia officer named George Washington. Washington's journey through Ohio's winter wilderness was harsh and unforgiving. Snow, freezing rivers, and dense forests slowed his progress. He relied on native guides, fragile alliances, and sheer determination. When he finally reached the French command, his message was delivered politely and rejected firmly. The French would not leave. This refusal echoed far beyond Ohio's forests. It confirmed that diplomacy had failed. What followed was not simply a border dispute, but the opening chapter of a war that would span continents. In 1754, Washington returned, this time with soldiers. Deep in the Ohio wilderness, Washington's men encountered a small French scouting party. Shots were fired. A French officer fell dead. The incident was brief, confused, and deadly, but its consequences were enormous. France called it an assassination. Britain called it self-defense. History would call it the spark. Washington hastily built Fort Necessity, a crude circular fort in a low meadow. It was poorly placed, vulnerable to flooding and attack. When French and native forces surrounded it, rain poured from the sky, soaking gunpowder and morale alike. Washington surrendered. The surrender mattered less than what it represented. War had begun. What started in Ohio soon ignited the French and Indian War, which merged into the global 7 Years' War. Battles erupted not just in North America, but in Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Empires mobilized armies and navies. Kings raised taxes. Cities burned, and all of it traced back in part to quiet rivers and contested forests in Ohio. For Native Americans, the war was a grim calculation. Most allied with France, not because the French were benevolent, but because French victory offered the best chance of slowing British settlement. French forts could coexist with native lands. British farms could not. Ohio became a battlefield. Forts changed hands. Villages were destroyed. Settlers fled. Raiding parties struck without warning. Warfare here was brutal and personal, blending European military strategy with indigenous tactics of mobility and surprise. No place felt safe. No victory felt permanent. The British suffered devastating defeats early in the war. Traditional European formations failed in forest combat. Columns marched into ambushes. Officers fell. Panic spread. Ohio's wilderness did not favor redcoats and rigid lines. It favored those who understood its shadows. Slowly, painfully, Britain adapted. More troops arrived. New strategies emerged. Forts were captured one by one. Supply lines strengthened. In 1758, British forces advanced on the heart of French power in the region, Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Ohio River. Outnumbered and isolated, the French destroyed the fort and withdrew. Britain rebuilt it and renamed it Fort Pitt. Ohio had changed hands. When the war ended in 1763, France ceded its North American territories east of the Mississippi to Britain. On paper, Ohio was now British, but paper could not erase reality. Native Americans had not surrendered their land. They had not agreed to British rule, and they quickly realized that British victory brought something far worse than French trade. It brought settlers. The war that began in Ohio reshaped the world. It redrew maps, shifted empires, and planted the seeds of the American Revolution. Britain's war debt led to colonial taxation. Colonial resentment led to rebellion. And Ohio, once a distant frontier, had played a central role in triggering events that would give birth to a new nation. As night settles over the land, imagine Ohio at this moment in history. Abandoned forts creak in the wind. Rivers flow past battlefields now reclaimed by grass and trees. Smoke rises from distant villages, while settlers gaze westward, already dreaming of land not yet theirs. The forests remain, but their silence has been broken forever. Ohio was no longer just a place. It was a turning point. Number 7. Drawing America's first frontier, extended as American surveyors pushed deeper into Ohio, they did not see villages, burial grounds, or ancient pathways. They saw measurements waiting to be taken. Chains were stretched across meadows. Stakes were driven into the soil. Trees were marked, cut, or counted. The land was transformed into data long before it was transformed into farms. This was something new in human history. Never before had a nation attempted to organize a frontier so systematically, so deliberately, before it was fully settled. Ohio became an experiment, a belief that land could be controlled by reason, law, and planning rather than by chaos and conquest alone. But land does not recognize intentions. Surveyors often worked under armed guard. They slept lightly, listening for movement beyond the firelight. Many knew they were measuring territory that others were fighting to protect. Their notebooks recorded distances and angles, but they could not record fear. Meanwhile, settlers followed closely behind. Some arrived legally, purchasing plots mapped out by the new grid. Others arrived illegally, squatting on land they knew would eventually be claimed. Cabins rose quickly, built from trees cut only steps away. Smoke from cooking fires curled into the forest canopy, a visible signal that permanence had arrived. For native communities, these signs were unmistakable. This was not temporary occupation, this was replacement. Leaders such as Little Turtle and Blue Jacket recognized the pattern. They had seen it before further east. First came traders, then forts, then settlers, then treaties, then removal. Ohio, they believed, was the last line where resistance might still succeed. A native confederacy began to take shape, not as a single nation, but as a shared purpose. Tribes with different languages, customs, and histories found common cause in survival. Ohio's forests once again became places of preparation rather than peace. American officials underestimated this resistance. Fresh from independence, the United States believed momentum was on its side. Land sales were essential to paying war debts. Ohio's orderly division into townships promised revenue, growth, and legitimacy. To slow expansion now felt unthinkable, so the frontier continued to move. Forts were rebuilt and expanded, supply routes improved, settlers grew bolder. Each success reinforced the belief that Ohio could be shaped at will, yet each mile gained came at a cost. Raids, counter-raids, fear, and grief on all sides. In eastern cities, Ohio was discussed abstractly. Politicians debated boundaries and ordinances. Newspapers printed optimistic reports of fertile land and endless opportunity. Few readers imagined the nightly tension of frontier life, the silence broken by distant footsteps, the uncertainty of dawn. Children grew up knowing the sound of alarm shots. Families learned to abandon homes at a moment's notice. Survival required cooperation, endurance, and luck. Ohio was teaching America what a frontier truly was. Not a line on a map, not a promise, but a process, slow, painful, and irreversible. The Northwest Ordinance spoke of education and liberty, yet its ideals existed alongside displacement and violence. Schools were planned even as villages burned. The contradiction was not lost on those who lived through it. And still, the grid advanced. Roads followed the survey lines. Towns formed at intersections. Names appeared, some native, some European, some invented to sound ancient. Ohio began to feel less like a wilderness and more like a future state in waiting. But beneath this emerging order lay unresolved conflict. Native resistance did not fade. It adapted. It learned American tactics just as Americans had learned forest warfare before. Battles became sharper, deadlier, more determined. Each side believed history depended on the outcome. Ohio was no longer simply a frontier being drawn. It was a frontier being defended. By the early 1790s, it was clear that planning alone could not secure the land. The United States would have to fight for the order it had imagined. The frontier would demand proof, not on paper, but in blood and resolve. As night fell across Ohio, survey markers stood quietly in the soil. Cabins glowed faintly with candlelight. Deep in the forests, councils met beneath the stars. Different futures were being planned in the same space, unaware that only one would survive intact. The lines had been drawn. The question now was whether they could be held. Number 8, a war for the land itself, the war that followed, was not announced with declarations or formal speeches. It arrived quietly in fragments. An attack here, a raid there, a cabin burned, a patrol lost. Ohio did not descend into chaos all at once. Instead, it tightened, like a held breath that would not be released. This was not a war for crowns or flags. It was a war for the land itself. For native nations, Ohio represented survival in its purest form. Every forest path, every river bend, every hunting ground carried memory and meaning. Losing the land meant more than losing territory. It meant losing a future. Children would grow up without the stories tied to place. Ancestors would be buried in ground no longer protected by their people. Resistance became inevitable. By the late 1780s, native confederacies strengthened across the region. Warriors moved carefully, using knowledge of terrain passed down through generations. The forests that had once been trade routes became defensive networks. Rivers became corridors of movement and escape. American settlements felt the pressure immediately. Isolated cabins were vulnerable. Small towns relied on nearby forts for protection. Fear shaped daily routines. Fields were worked quickly and cautiously. Weapons remained close at hand, even during meals. The United States responded as nations often do when challenged. It sent armies. But the young republic was not prepared for this kind of conflict. Early military expeditions into Ohio ended in disaster. Columns marched into ambushes. Supply lines collapsed. Morale faltered. Two major defeats shocked the nation, revealing that independence had not brought instant strength. Ohio humbled America. Native forces unified in purpose achieved victories few believed possible. Their success was not rooted in numbers alone, but in coordination, discipline, and deep familiarity with the land. This was not chaotic resistance, it was strategy. Yet victory carried its own burden. Every battle intensified American resolve. Losses were studied, mistakes corrected. The frontier forced adaptation once again. The United States began training a new kind of army, more disciplined, better supplied, and better suited for sustained conflict. This transformation culminated under General Anthony Wayne, a man known for patience rather than speed. His approach was deliberate. Forts were constructed slowly, connected by secure routes. Each advance was reinforced before the next began. Ohio's forests were entered not recklessly, but methodically. The war narrowed. Tension focused around key locations, river crossings, supply routes, contested villages. Skirmishes gave way to larger engagements. Both sides understood that a decisive confrontation was approaching. In 1794 it arrived. At a place remembered as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, storms had recently torn through the forest, leaving trees scattered and broken across the ground. The battlefield itself seemed exhausted. There, amid fallen trunks and tangled branches, native forces and the American army met. The battle was brief but decisive. American troops trained for this moment held their ground. Native resistance, though fierce, could not overcome the combination of discipline, numbers, and relentless pressure. When the fighting ended, the balance of power shifted permanently. The land had chosen its direction. The following year, the Treaty of Greenville formalized what the war had decided. Vast portions of Ohio were ceded to the United States. Native nations retained certain lands, but the frontier had moved beyond negotiation. The treaty promised peace, trade, and protection, yet it also acknowledged a reality that could not be reversed. Ohio was no longer contested territory, it was becoming American land. For settlers, the war's end brought relief and confidence. Migration increased rapidly, towns expanded, roads multiplied. What had once felt dangerous now felt inevitable. For native communities, the aftermath was heavy with loss. The land remained, but it had changed. Movement was restricted. Options narrowed. The future demanded adaptation under pressure. The war for Ohio had ended, but the consequences would echo for generations. As the forests slowly reclaimed battlefields, silence returned, though it was never the same silence as before. It carried memory, it carried mourning, it carried the weight of decisions made under fire. Ohio had been fought for, not because of what it was, but because of what it would become. The land itself had been the prize, and the cost had been permanent. Number 9, Part 1, From Wilderness to Statehood. When the fighting finally faded, Ohio did not immediately feel peaceful. The land was quieter, yes, but quiet in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than calm. Forests stood where battles had been fought. Rivers flowed past places where lives had ended. The frontier had survived its trial by fire, but it had not yet found its shape. Ohio now existed in a fragile in-between state. It was no longer a wilderness beyond control, but it was not yet a state. In the years following the Treaty of Greenville, movement into Ohio accelerated rapidly. Families arrived in wagons and on foot, carrying tools, seeds, furniture, and fragile hopes. Veterans claimed land grants. Speculators bought and sold plots they barely understood. Every path seemed to lead westward. The frontier began to thicken. Cabins that once stood alone were joined by neighbors. Trails widened into roads. Ferry crossings turned into bridges. Where there had once been temporary shelters, permanent structures began to rise. Ohio's forests echoed with the sound of axes, saws, and human voices planning a future, yet life remained uncertain. Disease spread easily. Crops failed without warning. Winters tested endurance. Isolation weighed heavily on the mind. Many settlers discovered that owning land did not guarantee security, it only demanded constant labor. Communities formed not out of comfort, but necessity. Neighbors depended on one another for survival. Barn raisings, shared harvests, and mutual defense became routine. Churches doubled as meeting halls. Schools appeared wherever a teacher could be found. These were not grand institutions, but modest beginnings, small signs of order emerging from hardship. Slowly, Ohio began to resemble society. Territorial government expanded its reach. Officials attempted to enforce laws across a region still shaped by distance and danger. Courts traveled from town to town. Sheriffs carried authority that depended as much on trust as on force. The idea of statehood hovered in the background. Under the Northwest Ordinance, Ohio had a path forward, a clear sequence that promised representation, stability, and legitimacy. Population growth was the key. Once enough people settled the land, Ohio could claim its place as a state. By the late 1790s, that threshold was approaching. Political debate intensified. Who should govern Ohio? Where should power be centered? How should land be taxed? Which towns would rise and which would fade? These questions mattered deeply to settlers whose lives were tied to the answers. At the same time, native communities faced a narrowing horizon. Though warfare had ended, pressure had not. Treaties continued to shift boundaries. Settlers pushed against agreed limits. Conflicts flared quietly, disputes over hunting, farming, and movement. Resistance no longer took the form of open war, but of endurance and adaptation. Ohio's transformation was not clean. It was layered. Old paths crossed new roads. Ancient burial mounds stood beside freshly cleared fields. Memory and ambition occupied the same ground, rarely acknowledging one another. In 1802, momentum became irreversible. Congress authorized Ohioans to draft a constitution. Delegates gathered to define the future of the territory. Many were young, ambitious, and deeply shaped by frontier life. Their priorities reflected experience, land rights, local control, and protection from distant authority. They worked quickly. There was no desire to linger in uncertainty. Statehood promised representation, infrastructure, and recognition. It promised that Ohio would no longer be an experiment. It would be permanent. When Ohio was admitted as a state in 1803, the moment passed quietly. There were no grand celebrations, no dramatic ceremonies, just signatures, acknowledgements, and the steady continuation of daily life. Yet the significance was enormous. Ohio was the first state carved entirely from the Northwest Territory. It became proof that the American frontier could be transformed into a functioning state. What happened here would become a model for everything that followed. Statehood did not erase hardship. Instead, it introduced new challenges. Government expanded, taxes increased, land disputes intensified, growth accelerated, the pace of change quickened, and with it came inequality, ambition, and conflict of a different kind. Ohio had crossed a threshold. The wilderness was no longer behind it, but neither was it fully gone. As settlers looked out over fields once dense with forest, many felt pride. Others felt unease. Something ancient had been replaced by something untested. The land had been reshaped, but its deeper consequences were still unfolding. Ohio had become a state, but it was still becoming itself. Statehood brought certainty on paper, but daily life in Ohio remained anything but simple. The frontier did not vanish the moment Ohio gained a place on the map. Instead, it shifted inward, into towns, farms, and institutions still learning how to exist. The land was filling quickly now. New arrivals came in steady waves, drawn by reports of fertile soil and open opportunity. Wagons creaked along rough roads. Riverboats carried families and supplies deeper into the interior. Ohio's population grew faster than anyone had predicted, and with that growth came pressure on land, on resources, on fragile systems of order. Towns expanded unevenly. Some flourished along rivers and trade routes, becoming centers of commerce and influence. Others faded quietly when roads bypassed them or soil proved less forgiving than promised. Ohio learned early that progress was selective. Not every dream survived contact with reality. Farming transformed the landscape. Forests fell at an astonishing pace. Fields spread outward from cabins and villages, changing the rhythm of the land itself. Where hunting once defined survival, agriculture now ruled daily life. Seasons were measured by planting and harvest rather than migration and trade. Yet dependence on the land remained absolute. A single failed harvest could still mean hunger. Disease continued to claim lives without warning. Medical knowledge was limited, and distance made help slow to arrive. Communities relied on shared labor and mutual trust more than on distant government. Law and order followed gradually. Courts became permanent, jails were built, disputes over land ownership multiplied as unclear surveys and overlapping claims came into conflict. Lawyers found opportunity in Ohio's rapid expansion, turning confusion into profession. Politics matured alongside settlement. Local elections mattered deeply. Representation was no longer abstract. It shaped roads, taxes, schools, and defense. Ohioans developed a strong sense of independence, shaped by years of self-reliance on the frontier. Authority was accepted, but only when it felt earned. The frontier had created a certain kind of citizen, hardy, suspicious of distant power, practical rather than idealistic. These traits would define Ohio's identity for generations. For Native communities, statehood marked a closing door. Treaties continued, but their outcomes grew increasingly predictable. Land was ceded, boundaries shifted, and pressure mounted. Removal was no longer a distant threat. It was an approaching certainty. Some adapted by integrating into the new economy. Others moved west, carrying memory and loss with them. Ohio's growth depended on this displacement, though it was rarely acknowledged openly. The land prospered. The cost remained largely unspoken. As decades passed, Ohio moved beyond survival and into influence. Its farms fed cities further east. Its rivers connected regions. Its towns produced leaders, soldiers, and thinkers. What had once been a dangerous frontier became a cornerstone of a growing nation. But traces of the past remained. Ancient mounds stood silently in fields. Old trails lingered beneath modern roads. Place names whispered histories most settlers no longer understood. The land remembered even when people did not. Ohio had become stable, but never simple. Statehood had delivered structure, yet it also locked in consequences. Choices made under pressure became permanent. Growth brought prosperity, but also inequality. Memory faded unevenly, preserved in some places and erased in others. By the early 19th century, Ohio was no longer becoming, it had arrived. Still, the state carried within it the story of its transformation. A story written not just in laws and borders, but in cleared forests, relocated peoples, and lives shaped by uncertainty. The wilderness had not vanished, it had been absorbed. As night settles across Ohio, fields lie quiet where forests once stood. Town lights reflect softly on rivers that carried canoes long before boats. The land appears calm, orderly, complete. Yet beneath that calm rests a layered past. One that shaped not only Ohio, but the path of a nation still learning how to live with its own expansion. Statehood was not an ending, it was a turning point. Number 10th, the quiet foundations of modern Ohio. Long after the wars ended, long after borders were fixed and governments formed, Ohio continued to change, but more quietly now. The dramatic clashes that once defined the land faded into memory, replaced by routines so ordinary they felt timeless. Plows moved through soil that had once known only footpaths. Church bells rang where warning shots had once echoed. Children played beside rivers that had carried warriors, traders, and soldiers before them. This was the quiet phase of transformation. Modern Ohio was not built in moments of victory or defeat. It was built in repetition, in seasons that followed one another without interruption, in habits formed by generations who no longer remembered why the land had once been feared. The frontier mentality softened, but it never disappeared. Settlers' grandchildren inherited a land already shaped, fields cleared, towns established, roads laid out in careful lines. To them, Ohio felt stable, familiar, even inevitable. Yet the instincts of survival remain just beneath the surface: self-reliance, suspicion of distant power, pride in work done by one's own hands. These traits became cultural foundations. Ohio's early communities valued practicality over spectacle. Towns grew with function in mind. Mills near rivers, markets near crossroads, homes clustered close enough for support but far enough for independence. Progress here was steady rather than flashy. Industry followed geography. Rivers powered mills. Forests supplied timber. Farmland fed growing cities. Ohio's strength emerged not from a single resource but from balance. Agriculture and industry developed side by side, shaping a state capable of sustaining itself. As transportation improved, Ohio became a connector. Canals linked regions. Railroads followed old trails. What had once been an edge became a center. Goods passed through Ohio on their way east and west. Ideas did the same. The state's role shifted from frontier to foundation. Yet even as Ohio modernized, traces of earlier worlds endured. Native mounds remained in quiet fields, their purpose debated, their meaning often misunderstood. Place names survived long after their languages faded from daily use. Rivers kept their ancient courses, indifferent to the names given to them. The land remembered more than people did. This quiet forgetting was not intentional, it was gradual. As generations passed, survival stories became history lessons, then footnotes, then curiosities. The urgency that once defined Ohio dissolved into comfort, but comfort itself was built on earlier uncertainty. Every farm rested on land once defended. Every town stood where choices had been made under pressure. Every road followed a path first traced by necessity. Modern Ohio inherited not just land, but consequence. The state produced leaders, innovators, and workers who shaped the nation far beyond its borders. Presidents, generals, reformers, all emerged from a place once considered wild and dangerous. Ohio's influence grew precisely because of its past, not in spite of it. The frontier had taught resilience, and resilience became tradition. Still, there is a certain quiet sadness woven into Ohio's foundations. Growth required erasure. Stability required sacrifice. Stories were simplified. Voices were lost. The land became productive but less shared. This complexity does not weaken Ohio's story. It deepens it. Because the truest foundations are rarely visible. They exist beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without demanding attention. Ohio's past works the same way, silent, persistent, present. As night settles over the state today, highways hum where forests once whispered. City lights glow above rivers that once reflected firelight and stars. The land feels settled, complete, finished, but it never truly is. Ohio continues, as it always has, layered with memory, a place shaped by conflict, ordered by ambition, softened by time. A land that moved from wilderness to frontier, from frontier to state, and from state to quiet cornerstone of a nation. The foundations are no longer loud. They do not need to be. They are already holding everything up.